It is a beautiful day to be alive, and I am so glad we have this time together. I'm Sana Laybourne, she, her. I am a professor, scholar, connector, and avid reader. I've always loved learning about what's happening in our social world and sharing that knowledge, especially over a good cup of coffee. And so here we are. Each week on Let's Grab Coffee, I catch up with experts from around the world who are investigating our most pressing social issues and common curiosities. Over the next hour, you'll learn about their inspirations, motivations, and of course, what they know about the world around us. So go ahead and grab your cup of coffee and get ready for an engaging and insightful conversation. When was the first time you saw yourself represented on screen? An actor or actress who looked like you? Every semester, I ask my students this question. After all, media shapes how we think about ourselves and others and often fills in the gap when we don't have firsthand experience with certain situations, places, circumstances, or even groups of people. Of course, for my students, most can usually point to a media representation that they think positively and accurately portrays people who look like them, but that hasn't always been the case, and certainly we still have a ways to go. For me, as an Asian American woman growing up in the 90s, Asian Americans weren't completely invisible, but we had limited and often stereotypical roles even then. I wonder what it would have been like to grow up with an Asian American actress to look up to. Today, we're delving into the life of our first Asian American movie star, the opportunities she seized, the challenges she faced, and the legacy she left. And to do so, today I'm joined by Katie Gee Salisbury, author of Not Your China Doll, The Wild and Shimmering Life of Anna May Wong. In addition to writing Not Your China Doll, Katie's work has appeared in the New York Times, Vanity Fair, The Believer, the Asian American Writers Workshop, and elsewhere. She was a finalist for the Jerome Hill Artist Fellowship in 2021 and gave the TED Talk As American as Chop Suey. Katie also writes the newsletter Half Caste Woman. A fifth generation Chinese American who hails from Southern California, she now lives in Brooklyn. Hi, Katie. So glad to have you with us today.
Hi, I'm so excited to be here.
Let me tell you, I had heard of Anime Wong, of course, from the commemorative quarter, and then even some of the Barbie and other kind of ways that anime has been celebrated and maybe even reclaimed a bit or amplified in more recent years. But that's really all I knew about her. So reading this book has been so eye-opening, but also really such a fun read. And so kudos to you as the author, because all in the margins of the book, I'm like, wow, how did she decide to include this detail? Or like, oh my goodness, when I'm reading it, I felt like I was reading fiction, honestly. And I was so enwrapped in this story of the wild and shimmering life of Anna May Wong. So thank you so much for writing this.
Oh, thank you. That's my dream for people to feel that way when they read the book. Selfishly, so all of this started out 20 years ago when I was, a 19-year-old college student doing my first internship at the Chinese American Museum in Los Angeles. And on my first day, I was shown a photograph in one of the larger exhibitions, and Anna May Wong was in it. And I didn't know who she was, but I immediately knew I had to know who she
Yeah.
was. I wrote the book somewhat selfishly because I wanted to live vicariously through her incredibly challenging, but also really fabulous and glamorous life. There's a lot of ups and downs, but just to be like a fly on the wall as she's going through all of it is a kind of wild ride.
Absolutely. And we'll get into a little bit of the twists and turns, but we won't give too much away. But I love that you followed that curiosity, right? That you saw this photo and you're like, who is this woman? What, there has to be some story here. What is it beyond kind of what I might be imagining just from this picture, or maybe even the little bits and pieces that you started to learn? So I think that is such a gift in and of itself to just say, hey, that spark, that's something, that curiosity, just follow it and you never know where it might lead.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think, one of the things that really drew me to her was, being part Chinese and having a Chinese American family that's been in the US for several generations, like her family. And also, my mom grew up in Los Angeles. She was born in Chinatown in LA, not far from where Anna May Wong was born and grew up. Our families are from the same area of southern China. So there was a lot of overlap. And so, in a way, learning about her story and her history was a way of looking at my own.
Mhm. Yeah, and I love that piece of it too. Kind of these parallel stories in a way about understanding more about yourself, even your family, but then Asian Americans more broadly in our history here in the United States. And that's something that I really appreciated about your book was the way that you were able to weave in these different historical moments, right? That were very much important to Anna May Wong's life, but I could imagine another author would not include those, right? And so the way that you decided to include so much of that historical context, I think for readers, they'll also get a much needed education about some of our Asian American history as well. And so I loved learning about and continuing to read about history and how it always is showing up in our lives, even today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the interesting thing about her life as well, right? Because she's born 1905, but she lives through so many interesting historic milestones. I mean, there's, of course, the Chinese Exclusion Act, which she herself has to, I mean, even though she's this famous movie star, she's still submitted to the same treatment. Like every time she wants to leave or re-enter the country, she has to ask for permission. She has to prove that she is who she says she is, go through an interrogation. So I think it's really eye-opening for people to see. I mean, even at that level where she's probably getting treated very nicely
Hmm.
compared to other, American, Chinese American citizens, but she still had to go through those things. And then, one of the other things I think about a lot too is World War II. I mean,
Hmm.
she, sentiment becomes very positive towards China and very negative towards Japan. But you see within, the Asian American community, Chinese Americans are wearing pins that say, I am Chinese, don't
Yeah.
attack me for being Japanese. And meanwhile, Japanese people are being put into internment camps. And there's all this propaganda around, supporting China and, attacking Japan. And so that's also a really interesting moment, both in our history as a country, but in Anna May Wong's career to see how she navigates that and what her attitudes are at the time. So it's an interesting um, and difficult part of our history.
I'm so glad that you incorporated those pieces because I think for a lot of us in the United States, well, first, we learn so little about Asian American history just in general, and then particularly even less about how various Asian ethnic groups were treated, not
Hmm.
as a monolith, how we might sometimes think about this idea of Asian America as being this encompassing identity, but very much, particularly in that time period, and even today with Asian ethnic groups very much identifying with their own ethnic group or with their own culture, but also, as you mentioned, these changing attitudes, sometimes very quickly, between demonizing and vilifying Chinese Americans and then Japanese Americans, or accepting to some extent Chinese Americans at one point, Japanese Americans at another. And I think that's something important for us to really understand, what these changing attitudes were, why, and then what we can learn from it today. And so I was really excited to see, again, all the history that you include in here in order to set the scene for her life. And so I say that because it does read like this fantastic story, right? I'm seeing this, in my mind's eye. And I know there are also efforts to create, a movie about her life. But even in your writing, I'm getting all of those ups and downs and, who she is, a good picture of who she was as an actress beyond the very limited roles that she had on the screen.
Luckily for me, Anna May Wong actually left quite a bit of primary source material. I mean, she gave so many interviews, but she
Hmm.
also had a very writerly sensibility. So her voice comes through very clearly in both interviews, but in a number of pieces that she wrote herself. So she wrote some memoir type pieces about her early life as a Chinese American. And then later, when she takes her first trip to China, she writes a series of essays about what that whole experience was like for her. So I really, with the book, I wanted to let her speak for herself, right? And let
Hmm.
you, as the reader, really get to know who she is. And I think the best way to do that is just to hear her talk and the way, just the way she speaks. I mean, she had such a great vocabulary, but also it's very, you see kind of her evolution as a person. She starts out as a flapper, so she speaks one way in the beginning, and then becomes a bit more cosmopolitan and polished as she travels the world, and is, making films in Europe and then goes to China. So, but I luckily there was all of that material, and so I mean that was one way I felt that I could. Um, let the story have you really immersed in her world through her own voice.
hmm Since we're talking a little bit about sources, I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about some of the sources that you did pull from. So obviously the interviews that she gave and some of her own writing, but I'm also picking up on other biographies or interviews that other people in her life or that were even tangentially kind of connected to her gave as well. Could you talk a little bit more about some of the sources that you drew from for this book?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it was a really wide and varied, batch of sources. So, I started with interviews and things that she had written, but also a lot of publicity pieces that were in early movie magazines. I did spend a lot of time reading other memoirs and biographies of her contemporaries in early Hollywood. So I got really into, the Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford and, what was going on with them when they were producing The Thief of Baghdad. And
hmm
so that was a part of it as well. I traveled to Europe to watch some of her very rare European films, and that gave me a lot of insight into the kinds of films she was making in Europe versus what she was making in the US.
hmm
I mean, there's so many different collections at the New York Public Library. Actually, there's a collection that she actually donated herself of her playbills.
Oh, wow.
So she went to all these different shows. So the fun thing about that is you can see where she was at different times. Like, so she was in London watching this show. And then you'll see some of the autographs she got from, like, clearly she went backstage after the show, schmoozed with some of the stars, got their autographs, ran into friends that way. I mean, then there's also correspondence. So she had some correspondence with Carl Van Vechten for almost
hmm
40 years, as well as correspondence between some of her friends. So I went and looked at, what were her friends saying about her when she wasn't around, that kind of thing. Um, and then what else was I going to mention? Oh, well, there were still actually some people who were alive who
hmm
had known Anna Wong. I mean, very few. I mean, she did die more than 60 years ago, but I was able to interview several of them. One was Conrad Doer, who just sadly passed at 103.
Oh,
But
wow.
he was actually one of the tenants at her home in Santa Monica called Moongate. So he had
hmm
quite a few memories of her. I also spoke to Marlene Dietrich's daughter, Maria Riva, who remembered being on set with Marlena and Anna May on the making of Shanghai Express.
mm
So really got some great insights from her. So really, tried to look at everything that I could. I mean, of course, there's still more. And I
hmm
think it's also an area that's ripe for other people to kind of jump in. I mean, now that so many more resources have been digitized, it makes it a lot easier to search them. So
hmm
I did also, a lot of newspaper research, which has kind of been an endless, there's like hundreds, thousands, an endless number of articles about Anna May Wong that were written about her during her life. So there's still a lot of, I think, area, like room for other people to continue the research.
And she lived such an exciting and full life that I'm sure there are many other stories that people could tell or other angles that people could take. And I love all of the correspondence that you include, all these letters that she's writing, which I was like, oh, that's so fun to be able to really get a glimpse into the relationships that she had and even how she was changing her perspective about a lot of different areas of her life over time, as you mentioned. What I found very compelling was how she decided to control her own narrative. So, although the different roles that she was being given in Hollywood were very limited, she understood that she could also leverage media and the press, as you mentioned, and be able to kind of tell her own story as she saw it at that time. So you talked about very briefly as we were just chatting this, her persona as a flapper, as she comes to understand, right? This is just a piece of who she is and who she doesn't want to be seen as anymore. And then later,
Mhm.
when she does travel to China, able to again, present essays and her perspective on that experience. And we see, again, another change in how she's thinking about herself and presenting herself to the world.
Yeah, she was such a shrewd operator in that way. I mean, she kind of had to be, right? Because she didn't
Hmm.
have like a huge studio behind her that managed all of her press. It was really her managing her own image. And so, I mean, one of the things that I always think is so funny and brilliant that she did, among many of these various stories, she was friends with a lot of reporters and newspaper
Hmm.
people, and they really loved her. I mean, those were genuine relationships. But one of the things that she did that I always find amusing is so she had to leave Hollywood in the late 1920s because they wouldn't give her leading roles because she was Asian, right? They said, well,
Hmm.
you can't star opposite a white male lead because that would be interracial mixing and we can't have that. So she was very fed up with that because she knew she was talented and wanted a meatier role. So she left Hollywood to go to Europe. She was there for almost 3 years making these incredible films that became, sensational all across the continent and in England. She became a huge star. And so suddenly Hollywood starts to think, well, maybe we messed up. Maybe we shouldn't have let her go. Maybe we should get her back. And so during that time, she gets an offer from, I think, some producer, something like that in Hollywood. And she writes a letter to him and then has the letter published, I think in the Los Angeles Times or someplace like that, basically saying, oh, thank you so much for the offer, but I don't think I'll be back home by Christmas.
Hmm.
I just had this great film in Berlin I got a standing ovation for, and now I'm going to open a play on the West End in England. And so it's her kind of, uh, you know, quiet way of saying thanks but no thanks, like I'm doing just fine without you, and it's really brilliant the way she pulls it off.
Yes, she was definitely very savvy in that way. And, you mentioned she didn't have the backing of kind of like the studio or press in that way. And it just makes me think about, how Hollywood did not invest in her, as you talk about in the book, right? They really did take her for granted. It wasn't until she goes to Europe and gets all of this acclaim and people love her so much that really Hollywood is feeling like, trying to save face more so than really acknowledging her talent. And so that's really unfortunate, but she's able to leverage that, right? At least for a little while when she comes back. And so I really appreciated learning kind of a little bit about her personality, right? Which does come through in a lot of the correspondence that you include, or just some of the other interviews that she gives as well. You mentioned very briefly the Thief of Baghdad, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that film and what it did, its role in Hollywood, but also for anime as well.
Sure. So Thief of Baghdad was this huge 1924 blockbuster made by Douglas Fairbanks. So at the time, it was Douglas Fairbanks, Mary Pickford, and Charlie Chaplin were like the three most famous actors in Hollywood. And they were so successful that they basically had their own production companies and studios so they could make their own starring vehicles. So they made their films. And so, in a sense, but Douglas Fairbanks was not only the star, but he was really producing this entire thing. And it was, they had this giant set made on Santa Monica Boulevard that looked like a Middle Eastern, like Arabian Nights type town. Thousands of extras. And he was looking for quote unquote exotic types because he wanted to fill his fantasy world with people who seem like they're from other places. So that meant he actually was going to, rather than cast, white actors who put on yellow face, he really wanted to cast Asian actors and other actors, Black actors, people from other places. So Anime Wong gets this opportunity to play the Mongol slave, which is her very unlikely breakout role. I mean, of all
Hmm.
things to play. So she's kind of playing this duplicitous character who's supposed to be working for the princess, but she's really working for the Mongol prince who's going to come in and try to take over Baghdad. There's a lot of Orientalist themes, right? I mean,
Hmm.
there's this whole idea that the Orient is everything that's not Western. So it's the Middle East, it's Africa, it's Asia, it's basically anything that seems exotic. I mean, of course, that works out for actors like Anime One because it's an opportunity. But at the same time, it is definitely a stereotype. She's playing a
Hmm.
stereotype. But luckily for her, she has this opportunity. She's in this kind of scene with Douglas Fairbanks that becomes very slapsticky. He's the thief of Baghdad in brownface. And so he's broken into the castle and he's trying to, steal some things from the princess's room. And then, she catches him. Anna May's character catches him, and he holds her at knife point. And anyways, it's a very memorable scene. And she was really the only person from that film who became incredibly famous afterwards. So that was a really important moment in her career. I mean, up to that point, she'd had one leading role in a smallish film and otherwise bit parts. So it catapulted her to international fame because that film was shown all over the world.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I love learning more about that film and all of the ways that it really shaped some of Hollywood at that time. And that was something else that I appreciated about the book was learning not just about Anna May Wong's life, but also about the development and growth of Hollywood into kind of what we know of it today. And so again, just the way that you're able to weave in all of this context about in this case, Hollywood, but then also other historical factors that are happening really makes this for a very rich view into, again, not just her life, but into the world that we currently live in, thinking about movies and how we think about, what we expect to see on screen, and even how we think about different characters or different people that we see on screen as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one of the things for me that was so interesting about researching early Hollywood was realizing that people like Anna May Wong, I mean, and a lot of other Asian Americans or Asians who had come from Japan and other places, were all working in Hollywood at that time. So there, I mean, there wasn't, I think we often think, oh, well, it's been hard to get Asian American representation because there just haven't been Asians working in the industry. And that's actually not true because they were there from the very beginning. And when you think about the beginning, because Hollywood was, this rough and tumble place, people didn't really know what they were doing or what like films were going to become. No one took
Hmm.
it seriously. So there was a lot of um, opportunity for women, for people of color, and anyone could kind of just be a part of it. And then later that changes, especially in the 1930s. And so we see those things happen throughout Anna May Wong's careers because it becomes more difficult for her to work
Hmm.
in Hollywood because they're essentially trying to create a specific narrative, right? And she's not a part of that vision that they have.
Hmm. I'm glad you mentioned that because while we think about movies today as like very glitzy, glamorous, almost esteemed, back in early Hollywood, it was very much not. And so I think that is a good reminder that this was kind of like people did not like actors and actresses and people who were creating movies. They saw them with a lot of skepticism and looked down upon them in many ways. And so those changing attitudes also about Hollywood and actors and actresses throughout her life also comes through in the book. I thought it was really interesting how you mentioned that they were key figures whose job was to kind of coordinate getting extras or actors from the Chinese American community onto these films and thinking about that. I think you write in the book that that actually became like its own role in Hollywood was someone who could actually interface with the Chinese American community to get extras for a variety of different films.
Yeah, I mean there were a number of kind of like cultural brokers who were able to go back and forth. In the early years, there was a man named trying to think of his name now. Uh, I'm forgetting his name, but his last name was Wang. And so Anna May Wong actually goes to him because when she wants to get into film, she says, will you help me? Can you get me into these films? And he's like, sure, I'm recruiting all these extras. So yeah, come along. So that's kind of how she gets her foot in the door. And then later on, with a lot of the bigger budget films that started getting made in the 1930s about China, since China became, there's a lot of things that were happening in Asia between China and Japan, and then going into World War II, there was a lot of things going on there. So China became kind of a perennial theme in Hollywood. So there was someone like Tom Gubbins, who would also, in addition to having like a prop store, he was recruiting people from Chinatown. He had grown up, I think, partially in Hong Kong or China, so he was fluent in the language and was hired to be an interpreter. But then he was also kind of ripping people off because he was
Yeah.
taking a cut of the money that the extras would earn when he recruited them. So that became a whole scandal, and people, people fought against that. They're like, "That's not right. You shouldn't be doing that to our community." But the interesting thing is that Hollywood films in the 1930s really became a kind of another revenue stream for a lot of working class people in Chinatown. And so one of the scholars whose work I cite in my book, William Gao, he has talked about this a lot. He actually just published a book called Performing Chinatown. And he focuses on the ways in which Chinatown and Hollywood had this kind of symbiotic relationship. Um, but yeah, I mean, it was a really important economically during the Depression for Chinese Americans to be able to get work in films as extras. So it's a really interesting, I mean, it's interesting because there's more extra work than there were like roles for Anna May Wong as a leading actress, right? So it's interesting to see the dynamics between that as well.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm so glad that you included that in your book. And even to your point about the man who ends up ripping people off and saying, like, I need a cut for, getting you as an extra in this film. And then Hollywood responds by creating kind of like this structured position where they're also ensuring that this isn't happening, which I thought was really fascinating as well.
Right. So that's because of the whole, scenario with Tom Gubbins and other people in the Chinese community, saying this is not fair, your practices are not fair, that Hollywood creates the central casting,
Hmm.
which now is like this, everyone knows like people go there to get cast in all these kind of ethnic parts or very specific background roles. But that was, yeah, so Chinatown had a direct role in that institution of Hollywood.
Yes, I mean so much, history of Hollywood in this book. And even as you mentioned, like thinking about how Chinese Americans were employed as extras in films, which is something that I never really thought about or, heard about. And so I was really interested to learn that piece and then to know about this book that William Gao has out, Performing Chinatown, because again, just thinking about all the pieces of American history and Asian American history that we just don't think about or know about. And so again, just another way for us to learn more about our history. And so I really appreciated learning about that as well. Something else that really stuck out to me, what you just said, was there are all these roles for extras, Chinese American extras in these films. Yet Anna May Wong was really barred from playing any leading roles. Honestly, they would always go to white women in yellow face, and there was no problem. Hollywood saw no problem with that. And it's kind of ironic in that Hollywood justified some of these practices, saying, well, we don't have enough Asian Americans in film, Asian American actors and actresses, and yet we have all of these, hundreds of, Chinese American extras in a variety of different films.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of hypocrisy in that, definitely. And that's one of the reasons that I focus so much on The Good Earth in the
Hmm.
book, which is a film that Anna May Wong is famously not in.
Yes.
But I thought it was just too rich with these contradictions to ignore. And I think it's also important to understand how Hollywood conceived of Asians or Chinese, how they were creating these narratives about
Hmm.
China or Asia without really the influence or input of Chinese Americans or Chinese at the highest levels. I mean, of course, they had, a government person from the Chinese government overseeing things, but it wasn't at the level of, well, actually, we should have these characters played by Chinese actors.
Hmm.
Um, so I do spend a lot of time on that film, and you get to see the ways in which, they make up excuses for why they can't cast more
Hmm.
Asian actors, right? Like, oh, we went up and down the coast, the West Coast, and interviewed and auditioned all of these different, Chinese Americans, and either they're, too Chinese because they don't speak English well enough, or they're too American and they don't
Hmm.
they don't even look Chinese to us, which is like you just can't win with them.
Hmm.
Um, and then they end up having a German actress, Louise Reiner, play the lead female character in Yellowface. And the irony of that is that she's basically, fresh from Germany and still practicing her English. So
Hmm.
she herself has an accent in English, but it's okay. Like that, for
Right.
some reason, that's like the right kind of accent. So there's just, they just make excuse after excuse. And the reality is they just weren't willing to put Asian actors in those lead roles. And that's something that Hollywood is still grappling with today. I mean, despite the fact that we're seeing a bit of a renaissance in Asian storytelling, with a lot of Asian American and Asian creators who are in the
Hmm.
writing room, who are the directors, the producers, etc. But you still hear those stories about, oh, well, I sent my script to so and so, and they said, well, can you change the lead actor to a white woman or a white man? And that conversation is still being had today.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, towards the end of the book, you include some of the research that a sociologist and colleague of mine, Nancy Ewan, does about Asian American representation on screen. And, absolutely, even though we have some key blockbuster movies that have come out recently, when we think about, over time and even into the future, what is to come, like, will that be something that continues? Or is this kind of like, oh, you have your everything everywhere all at once, right? Or your a couple other feature films and like that's good enough.
Right. I mean, yeah, I love Nancy's work. I think it's so important and because it sheds light on this idea on the because a lot of people will a lot of white actors will say, well, I should be able allowed to play any role because I'm an actor, right? That's what art is. That's what actors
Hmm.
do. And yes, in theory, that is true, except that for any other actor of color, they don't get the same opportunities that a white actor gets, right? There
Hmm.
isn't race blind casting when it comes to actors of color. They are only playing the roles that people think they are racially or ethnically suited towards. So it's great when we have Crazy Rich Asians or The Farewell or Shang-Chi or all these films that are predominantly Asian casts. But what happens when they want to play a role that's just a role that's not
Hmm.
has doesn't have anything to do with being Asian? They don't get cast, and that's the real issue.
Absolutely. I want to go back to something you mentioned about the good earth because this production, it seems like it is very unique in this period in Hollywood. It takes an extremely long time, it feels like, to make this film. And then there's a lot of work on the production side to create like the stage and this for this film. And in this, and I'm glad you spent so much time talking about the good earth because this is where we see Anime Wong really make a big stand for who she sees herself as an actress and the roles that she does deserve in Hollywood. And I'm wondering if you could talk about Anime Wong and kind of some of the decisions and again that savviness with media as well that she kind of
Mhm.
leverages in talking about the good earth and her role, or actually not her role in it.
Yes, I mean, I think this is one of the most like courageous moments in her career, really. So, of course, everyone thinks that she should get the lead role in The Good Earth because who else could play a
Right.
Chinese role? She's the only Chinese American actress of note. So when she doesn't get it, it's not surprising because this has been a trend in Hollywood, right? So Louise Reiner gets the lead role. MGM still says, well, why don't you come and audition for this secondary role? And it turns out it's kind of the only unsympathetic role, which is her name's Lotus, which is a role that, Anime Wong's played many women named Lotus at this point. She's like the tea house girl who seduces Wong Lung, who's the male lead, the farmer, and then he marries her as his second wife. And she kind of brings disharmony to the family, right? Because there's now this other woman in the picture. So they auditioned her for that role twice. In the notes from MGM, they didn't seem very positive towards her for the role. They said, oh, she's not beautiful enough. Don't think she's convincing, too old. She was like 30, 31 when she auditioned for that role. Too old.
Hmm.
Um, and according to another newspaper column that I found, she ultimately wasn't offered that role. She was offered an even smaller role that was
Hmm.
a supporting role to the Lotus role. None of this comes out publicly, really, except for that one column, which I think gets lost and no one pays attention to it. But Anna May Wong herself is, you know, going through this process. She writes a letter to her friend Fania saying, well, everyone tells me I should do the Lotus role if there's lots of money in it. but I think what I'm gonna do instead is go to China.
Hmm.
And so knowing that she in truth didn't even get the Lotus role, she just comes out and says, "Look, I'm not gonna take a role in this film when you're asking me to play an unsympathetic role." And MGM never challenges her version of the story. They say nothing about it. But she just says, "Look, they offered me the Lotus role and I'm not going to take it," which is a huge thing for her to do, right? To stand up to Hollywood and say she's not going to take a role in this blockbuster production that everyone's been following for the last 5 years. And instead, she's going to create this whole counter narrative where she's going to China. So it's essentially her saying, look, if you want to see what China is really like, why don't you come with me? Otherwise,
Hmm.
you can watch this fake version that Hollywood's going to manufacture with white people playing Chinese.
Hmm.
And so it's really her, this whole publicity thing that she's um, created for herself. And there's actually a great photo where she sails for China almost around the same time production begins on the Good Earth. And she stops in Honolulu on the way to Asia. And there's this great photo where she's drinking a sip of tea and she kind of has this certain expression on her face. And the headline's like, you know, anime Wong gives a Shanghai gesture to Hollywood. It's like her FU to Hollywood, but they
Right.
say it in such a diplomatic and funny way. But she goes on and she documents her travels. She has Newsreel Wong, who's this guy who is a photojournalist, but he also creates newsreels for Hearst. So she's filming her travels, which are getting sent back to the US, and later she makes a documentary out of them. And then she's also writing these articles for the New York Herald Tribune, which are syndicated across the country. And so, because she's an American, she's also able to introduce other Americans
Hmm.
to what China is like and what's surprising about it to her. And you also see a much more sophisticated urban version of China versus
Hmm.
the one in the Good Earth, where it's like these peasant farmers dealing with, still important issues that dealing with famine and drought and class distinctions and things like that, but those aren't really as relevant to people who, I mean, in the US in the 1930s, who are living in cities. That's not a relative relate as relatable anymore. So she's showing them a side of China that I think was rarely being shown to the American public at that time.
Hmm. How impactful do you think that was to the American public? Like being able to maybe read, some of the articles in the New York Herald Tribune or where it was shared, throughout the country, or even seeing later, some of the documentary that she was able to create from her travels. What type of impact, or are you even able to gauge like what type of impact that might have had on American society at that time?
It's definitely hard to gauge, but I do think it was an important alternative to
Hmm.
like a Hollywood narrative, right? Because people were reading those newspapers, and also were probably entertained. I mean, she was such a charming person. So
Hmm.
even just the way she tells the stories about the experiences she's having and the people that she's meeting, I'm sure it raised a number of eyebrows, like, oh,
Hmm.
China sounds different than what I would expect. Um, but I think the other piece of that that was important too was to see her speak out about what was going on in Hollywood. Because when she returns from China, so she goes to China, has this life-changing experience, and
Hmm.
she also actually experiences a lot of criticism in China, right?
Yes.
Because many people and the press especially are not happy with the way that they feel she's portrayed them in
Hmm.
Hollywood, right? Because the reality is, even though she's Chinese American, she's a symbol of all Chinese people everywhere and maybe all Asian people
Yeah.
at that time because it's so
Yeah.
rare to see someone like her in an American film. So she, despite not having had control over her early career, like what role she was going to take on, she listens to all this criticism and she really takes it to heart. So when she comes back to the US, she says again publicly, Hollywood won't cast Chinese actors in Chinese roles.
Hmm.
And that's I think a really brave thing for her to say. And frankly, there were a lot of people, I mean, a lot of fans who were behind her because she had this enormous draw. There were a
Hmm.
lot of people who had loved her for many years and were always disappointed that she wasn't put into better films. And so, in a sense, she's able to parlay this whole thing into a new series of films at Paramount. They are B movies, so they're lower budget, but she has a lot more influence and control over them. And so she starts to make some groundbreaking films that I think also were important in changing the narrative around China, but also Asian Americans. So the first one she makes is called Daughter of Shanghai with Philip Ahn in
Mhm.
1937. He's a Korean American actor, also her childhood friend. So they get to make this film together, and they're playing the heroes. Meanwhile,
Mhm.
all the villains are played by white actors. Um, so she really flips the script. And then, unlike some of her earlier films where she either had to die or had, terrible endings, in this film, she gets a happy ending. So her character and Philip Bonds end up together, they get married. And they actually became the first Asian American actors to play a leading romantic role in the sound era. So
Mhm.
that was like a groundbreaking thing. And, whether people noticed how groundbreaking it was is hard to say, but I think it certainly, um, hopefully opened people up to the fact that there are Asian Americans and that they can be leading, actors in a film.
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, I think that is, such a moment. And, as I was reading, I was like, oh my goodness, like this is amazing. Like, why don't I know about this? Right. But again, like we often don't know so much about Asian American history. And so I was like, wow, what a moment to have these two Asian Americans play this romantic couple on screen and both of them live. And so that's also, a major moment that they don't die on screen. And then, like you said, these are also childhood friends in real life. So, I mean, what fun that must have been for them to be in this film together. Another way that she's able to really leverage kind of her position, you mentioned King of Chinatown, the film. And what I was really taken in by was the fact that she's able to convince them to take some B-roll of LA's Chinatown Festival at that time. And so you actually have, archived and preserved in this film, right? Like actual scenes from Moon Festival in Chinatown during that time. And I was like, wow, that's so amazing.
Yeah, it's a really special film. And actually, I feel like King of Chinatown is kind of an underrated gem in her filmography. Um, and it's a beautiful story. It's really about a lot of scenes from Chinese American life. It's a biopic, a fictional biopic of a woman named Dr. Margaret Chung, who was the first Chinese American woman to become a doctor, and she became a well-known figure because she actually was a doctor to a lot of celebrities in Hollywood, but also did a lot of charity and was really involved in the war efforts and trying to fundraise aid for refugees in China during the war. So it's this beautiful film where she's playing a doctor, but you also get to see the kind of intergenerational relationship between her character and her character's father, who runs a Chinese herb shop. So she's like the new modern doctor, and he's like kind of the old school doctor, and you get to see them banter back and forth. She invites her colleagues from the hospital home for Chinese New Year dinner. So
Mhm.
they like celebrate together. I mean, I can't think of another film in that era that you would have seen something like that. And then they go to a boxing match, and one of the boxers is Chinese American, and he wins. So there's all these little nice scenes that, if you were Chinese or Chinese American and you spent time in Chinatown, it really means a lot to you to see people from your community on screen. And like even for me, seeing that, I don't know, like 80, 90 years later, it was like dazzling. I was like, wow, like I can't believe that she made this film.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking about, even now I'm seeing a lot of different Asian American film festivals and screenings of some of these earlier films. Um, and I'm just thinking about, again, like how much of this kind of film history often is lost, right? So certainly there are a lot of films, terrible representation then and now. But then there are also, as you mentioned, these gems that, I mean, wow, like what a groundbreaking film, particularly in that time period. But even now to watch it and to be able to even see like some of these universal themes that you can still very much identify with as well.
Right. And I think that's why looking at people like Anime Wong or lesser known people from Hollywood or in any arena really is so important because their stories get lost to time when we don't keep them alive. And it's not that I mean, I think there's so many of us who are interested and inspired, by, Asian American films. And it's not that, I mean, I think there's so many of us who are interested and inspired, by, Asian American films. And it's not that, I mean, I think there's so many of us who are interested and inspired by people like them who were working 100 years ago and facing much steeper challenges than we have now. And so, I mean, that was part of the reason I really wanted to write about her, because when I learned about her 20 years ago, um, I went home and asked my mom, "Do you know who this is?" And she's like, "The name sounds familiar, but I don't really know anything about her." And I kept asking around, and no one knew who she was anymore. And I couldn't. That just seemed like what an injustice that such an important figure in Hollywood could be like totally forgotten. And like, who's
Mhm.
keeping her story alive? And so to me, it was like, well, I got to do something about this.
Yeah, and we're so glad that you did because it would be such a tragedy to lose her story, to history. Even in the book you mentioned, she was also the first Asian American actress in like a TV serial. And now I'm forgetting the name of that series, but that
The
is
gallery of
lost to history.
Yes. Yeah, the Gallery of Madame Liu Song was, yeah, and I mean, we know about the series that she created in 1951, but unfortunately, there's no copies of it. Of the company, the te television company that produced it, Dumont, went bankrupt and supposedly, just offloaded all of their reels of everything, all the tapes into the East River in New York City. Of all things to do with it. But many people are still hoping that one day it turns up, and there's, I think, maybe one behind the scenes photograph taken of her filming it. But right, like it's these things disappear, and um, who is telling the history or the story really matters because people like her get left out.
Mhm. Absolutely. Well, I know that your research into anime Wong continues and your interest in anime Wong continues. I wonder, is there anything else, any piece of her story that maybe didn't make it into the book that you're like, oh, this is like a little tidbit or something that maybe you're interested in learning more about as you think about her life and her legacy?
All the time. I mean, I learn new things about her probably every week. And so it's like, oh, I could have put that in the book. And that's also why I have a newsletter, Half Caste Woman,
Hmm.
because when I learn new things, I like to do a little deep dive into some of the research. And one thing that I recently found out, and I would like to do some more research into it, was so there's the Los Angeles Breakfast Club has been around for a long time in LA. They're kind of like a social club that has people come and talk about different topics once a week, but they also host many different things. And so apparently there was like a joint fundraiser, I think in like 1940, between the NAACP and China Relief, which
Mm.
was a cause that Anime Wong was very involved in during the war years in fundraising money for Chinese refugees. And so this was like an incredible event that the NAACP in Los Angeles threw to raise money for them. And they had all these stars there. I mean, Hattie McDaniels, the Nicholas brothers, like all of these incredible Black stars. And Anime Wong was there too. So I love to see that solidarity that they had between those two communities. So I want to know more about that event and see if I can like find a photograph of her there. That would be really special. And interestingly, Anime Wong and Hattie McDaniel are actually buried in the same cemetery
Oh,
in Los
wow.
Angeles. And it was, I think, the first like integrated cemetery in
Mhm.
LA. So, which is why they're there. But anyways, so it's that's just an example of like the kind of things that I still stumble upon. I'm like, oh my God, that sounds so interesting. I have to know more about it.
Yes, absolutely. Well, we're so glad that you followed that initial interest and curiosity from seeing that photo of Anime Wong, several years ago now at this point, because Not Your China Doll is a phenomenal book. Thank you so much for writing it, and thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you again to Katie G. Salisbury. Her book is Not Your China Doll: The Wild and Shimmering Life of Anna May Wong. This book is absolutely phenomenal. Whether you're interested in Anna May Wong as the actress, whether you're interested in learning more about early Hollywood, this is a story, a real life story that, trust me, will definitely draw you in. I had so many notes in the margins. not just about Anime Wong's life, but also these other pieces of history that I think really fill out this story and really are important to understanding who Anime Wong was in the context of Hollywood, but also in the broader context of our country and what was going on around the world as well. Anime Wong was the first internationally renowned Chinese American screen actress, the first born and bred Asian American movie star, the first Asian American to lead a television series, and the first woman of color to become a movie star within the Hollywood system. Trust me, this is a story that you will absolutely love. And then you're probably going to want to watch some of the films that Anime Wong starred in as well. And if you love this conversation, you probably want to learn more about Anime Wong. You could always subscribe to Katie's newsletter, Half Cast Woman. I know I definitely have to subscribe because I'm interested in knowing all these other additional details about Anime Wong's life as they surface as well. One thing that really inspired me about Anime Wong's life, I mean, so many things were inspirational, but what I really appreciated learning about her life, especially in the time period in which she was living, was how she was able to take control of her own narrative and really think about how she wanted to shape the perception of her. And I thought that was really empowering and encouraging the many ways that Anime Wong took control of the narrative, represented and presented herself in the way that she wanted to be seen, and then constantly was reinventing herself as well. Her story is absolutely inspiring. Well, for today's positive note, I want to leave you with this reminder. Each and every day, you get to decide. Yes, you get to decide what type of day it's going to be and how you'll show up in this world. Over time, those daily choices create not only your life, but the world around us. So, what are you creating? Well, this has been Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR 91.7 FM Memphis. I'm Sana Laybourne. I'm here every Monday, and I can't wait to be back with you next week. And look, in the meantime, go ahead and subscribe to Let's Grab Coffee in podcast format, available wherever you stream podcasts. That's way you never miss a conversation. And you can also go back and re-listen to today's conversation or previous conversations as well. I'll see you back here next week on Let's Grab Coffee.